Carolyn Glick. Welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Mideast News Hour. I'm joined by my host, Gadi Taub. Hey, Gadi.
Hi, and Shana Tova, Nachon. We won't have a podcast before the end of the Jewish year. That's our last one.
Well, you're absolutely right. This is our last meeting before the year 5762 begins.
Yeah,
So,
and we bless each other.
Sorry, 5772. 57. Boy, I'm terrible. 5772.
And we bless each other by you're asking the wrong person. I can tell you what year is it to the death of Christ, because we live in Tel Aviv. It's a different thing. But we bless each other here in Israel that tichle shana v'kilelotea. Let the last year and its curses end, and let the new year and its blessings begin. And boy, was the last year full of curses. It was a horrible, horrible year. So let's hope that this is the lowest point. The nadir, do you say?
Nader.
Nader.
The nader.
As in Ralph Nader. Yeah. Okay.
He's definitely a nader. But naders with an IR and naders with an ER. Anyway, enough of the English lesson for today. We're going to move on to geopolitics, if that's okay with you. So, yes, in this last episode of this very difficult year that we're just completing and hopefully moving into a new and better year, we really are reaching a crunch point. As all of you guys have watched, the United States is now in the middle of, or has just suffered the greatest defeat in post-World War II U.S. history. I mean, what's happening in Kabul, what's happening in Afghanistan, following the America's humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Is it worse than Saigon 75?
I think it is, because the Vietnamese left the Americans alone after they left. Now, it's true, it was terrible it did, you can look at it many different ways, but you can say that the United States didn't suffer direct repercussions from their defeat in Vietnam the way that they're very likely to suffer direct repercussions from their defeat in Afghanistan. You already are seeing much of the U.S. hardware. There were pictures today, I think it was, of Humvees traveling on a road in Iran, so that people were saying that the $90 billion worth of munitions that the United States abandoned in Afghanistan were in the hands of the Taliban, and they would likely share them with China. Well, here they already are sharing them with Iran. And we're talking about advanced platforms. And I saw that the Pentagon spokesman, who's a strange man, I must say, he was saying, oh no, we disabled all of those weapons, as if the Chinese wouldn't be able to reverse engineer them. I mean, the Iranians, all of their drone warfare is a result of President Obama not demanding or the return of the American drone that the Iranians shot down, and or blowing it up in Iran once it was taken, and the Iranians were able to reverse engineer that drone. And most of the drone wars that we see being carried out by the likes of the Houthis and the Iranians themselves are the consequence of that American drone that fell into their hands. And now you have an entire American army that's fallen into their hands in terms of the weapons that they left behind, not to mention the Afghan military that was abandoned there, and they're all being shot in killing fields.
But Caroline, how do you explain this? How do you explain the amazing debacle? How do you explain, why is there no one at the helm? I mean, I don't think that Joe Biden is really in control or is in full cognitive power, but there are people around them. Some of them are professionals. So is that just a complete blindness to reality, or is there malice, or how did it get so bad?
Well, I think that there are a couple of explanations for that. One is, you look at Jake Sullivan, and he looks like he's 12 years old. I wouldn't trust him, if he was trying to sell me a new car. I can't believe that he's national security advisor. He's just fundamentally not a serious person. And I have to say the same thing about Tony Blinken. He just doesn't strike me as somebody who has, I would say he doesn't have the gravitas to perform the functions of Secretary of State, but you've had a lot of secretaries of state who didn't necessarily have gravitas, but it just seems to me like he just doesn't understand international affairs. Basically, I wrote in my latest Newsweek article that's going to be coming out on Thursday of this week that, you have this weird, you have this fundamental assumption that's shared by most of the people in the Biden administration, and we saw it here in Israel with the Barak government in 2000 with the withdrawal from Lebanon. We saw it in the Sharon government with the withdrawal from Gaza as well. So we've had our share of this idiocy. But it's this idea that people are only fighting the United States because the United States has provoked them in some way, that it's done something. And so the idea with the Taliban, and it's very clear that this is sort of their idea fix with the withdrawal, that the Taliban can now be the United States' partner, because the only reason that the Taliban was opposed to the United States was because the United States was in Afghanistan. And that was the thinking that made Israelis convinced that we could leave the security zone in southern Lebanon, because the idea that the likes of Yossi Beilin and his like-minded, brain-dead radical leftists were selling to the public was that Hezbollah was just going to turn into a normal political party. They were going to break with Iran, which of course completely controls them and owns them. They were going to do all of those things and just become, liberal Democrats. The minute that Israel left South Lebanon, the only reason that they were fighting Israel was because we were there. If we left, they would go away. And of course, that's not at all what happened. They followed us into Israel because they exist in order to annihilate Israel. They're motivated not by where Israel is, but that Israel is. And we didn't want to believe that. And of course, the same thing pertained with Gaza. And here in Afghanistan, what are they saying? They're saying, oh, we're not threatened by having left them with $90 billion worth of U.S. weapons. And by the way, they also left them a lot of cold hard cash. I sent out this, I think we might have posted it, or we were thinking about posting it last week, which was a video of these Taliban going into this U.S. base. And there were just stacks of like $100 bills there in like these huge piles. And that was, hundreds of millions of dollars sitting right there in cash, and the Taliban were just fanning it out. So some of it's cash, but they have advanced fighter craft, they have combat aircraft, they have jets, they have a vast array of helicopters, armored vehicles, hundreds of thousands, I think, of night vision goggles, which is incredibly dangerous. And just, they've become the most powerful terror army in the world. And so, and the Americans think it's okay because because we left Afghanistan. So the Taliban can now be our friends. And the Taliban, just like Israelis said, we can make a deal with the Hezbollah as soon as we leave Lebanon. It's not going to be a problem. So here too, you're getting these incredibly stupid and crazy statements by Biden, by Blinken, and by Sullivan that, the UN is going to, they're going to put out a really nasty resolution against the Taliban. They're going to say, you're bad guys. We don't like you. If they
I don't know if you saw
there was, if they execute American citizens and
one of the American envoys posted something on Twitter. I wouldn't be able to find it now on the fly, which said that the Taliban now has a great challenge. It will have a chance to show if it will bring about the human potential of its men and women in its very diverse and rich culture. You see, these people are complete, and I studied in American university when it was not so bad as it is now. But this is a consequence of 40 years or so, maybe more, maybe since the 60s, that politics and ideology and the whole elite is educated on the idea that ideology and politics are therapy. The question is not what the world is. The question is, how do I use my political stance to purify myself? So when this is extrapolated, and Barack Obama is the prime student of that, because the world stage is a place is a psychodrama. It's the place to resolve your own feelings of guilt, and when this is projected on the world, we get a perverted therapeutic version of the Suez crisis, because in the Suez crisis, it was Eisenhower, who was not sentimental, but was very American in the old sense, in the sense that all problems are practical and we're going to solve them practically, who completely misunderstood Nazi, right? The idea was, let's distance ourselves from the history of colonialism, and if we're nice to the radical Arabs, then they'll have skin in the game. They'll reciprocate. They will not hate us anymore. And this is a complete inability to understand what radicalism is. They just don't take it seriously. They think that the other party is exactly like them, and that it's all a game of who offended who, and who will be the victim, and who will play what part in this therapeutic drama. I'm sorry, this is the far background of what we're seeing here now.
No, I think you're right, but I think that we can look at it sort of under three kind of we can sum this whole thing up through three headlines. The first one is Marxism, right? Because Marxism is sort of a post-Christian faith, right? And so the idea that you can purify yourself through politics, that politics is really virtue signaling, and it's about atoning for your sins, and America's original sin being slavery, and that America is part of this whole post-colonialist guilt that really belongs to the Europeans, but America will be lumped into that. And then the idea is that everything is our fault. We're the only actors on the world stage. And all of these third world primitive people, they're our victims by virtue of the fact that they aren't us. And so that the way that you purge yourself of the sins of your past, of being strong, of being powerful, is by self-abnegation and by empowering your enemies. When people say that you make peace with your enemies, I mean, that's true up to a point. Obviously, you don't need, America doesn't need to make peace with Canada, but it did need to make peace with Canada after the World War of 1812, when the British kicked the Americans' butt, burned down Washington, D.C., and the Americans had to sign the Treaty of Ghent, which said, okay, never mind, we're not going to try to invade Canada again. So that, that was a peace treaty made between enemies because the United States had been defeated. And that's the point, is that the Americans didn't defeat the Taliban. The Taliban defeated the Americans. And so the people who are leaving with their tail between their legs are not the Taliban, it's the United States. And the idea basically of this kind of post-Christian cultural Marxism that really is so emblematic of American political discourse today, and unfortunately American foreign policy under the Biden and Obama administrations, is that they think that the way to cleanse America of its past is actually to lose. And that's also sort of what's at root of the Iran nuclear deal, right? Because they're giving Iran the bomb in the JCPOA. It's an existential threat to Israel because Israel recognizes that Iran's animosity towards Israel has nothing to do with anything that Israel has done, or anything that the United States, for that matter, has done. It's the fact that Iran is a theocratic, fanatical, jihadist theocracy with global imperialist aspirations, and the first place that they want to annihilate is Israel. And so the Americans think, well, we're going to make peace with the Iranians by empowering them and changing the power balance of our ally Israel and Iran in a way that makes them more equal, because Israel's bad because it's more powerful than Iran. So it's all very religious, and in that sense it is sort of quintessentially American, because even Eisenhower's kind of practical thing where we can all get together also, is based in a lot of ways in kind of in the kind of religious gestalt of the mainline Protestant church at the turn of the 20th century. So, I mean, and then finally, just the last, so that it's Marxism, in terms of being a faith, it's anti-Americanism, which is at the core of this faith, that it's America that has to change, or its allies in Israel's case that have to be cut down to size in order to repair the world, repair the damage of the colonialist era of Western power. And then the final thing that, and is also very common to the Israeli left, is narcissism. Right? This is all very narcissistic. You see the world and you see yourself. You don't see anything but yourself. You see everything as it relates to you. The Taliban in this equation is not even an actor. And if you notice that when Biden was casting blame for what has happened in Afghanistan, for his decision to abandon Americans to their fate and America's Afghan allies, and by the way, their service dogs, which I think is just, as the owner of 2 dogs and a dog lover, I mean, I just think that it's so abominable. The whole thing is so disgusting. They left children behind. They left. I mean, it's a moral blight on America's record that's not going to go away in coming generations. At any rate, I mean, everything about this is obscene.
But Caroline, you didn't answer my question about how they reach this point. Is this stupidity? Is this cockiness? Is this malice? Is what on earth? Because I'm trying to think, I'm not a friend of the Biden administration, but I'm trying to think in their shoes. Why the hell would they do it so badly? Why the hell would they leave the biometric information of the people who collaborated with them behind? Why the hell would they leave all this equipment? Couldn't they do it in a slower fashion? Couldn't they do it in a more gradual way? Couldn't they first take care of security? Couldn't they respond in the middle when they saw it was collapsing with returning some of their air power? What is this apocalypse? I don't know if you use this idiom in English. How would you translate that?
Yeah, well, it's like a total eclipse. It's like they're completely blind to reality. They're willfully blind in this case. And why are they this way? I mean, part of it could probably be explained by dementia. I mean, that this is irrational, that it didn't make any sense when they saw, this Biden has been trying to attack the intelligence services, saying that nobody warned them that the Taliban was going to collapse. But then the intelligence services were helpful in leaking the transcript of a conversation that Biden had in late January with the Afghan president, Ghani, where he said that everybody feels like you're collapsing and we have to change the perception on the ground. So
that's because their whole attention was focused on showing that the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of that, but only in the sense that when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense say that climate change is the gravest strategic danger facing the United States, and that and white supremacy, and they've actually been using the term purge to get rid of, to purge the backbone of the U.S. military out of the service by, saying that, anybody who opposes the election results or is identified with the protests against the certification of the elections on January 6th and all kinds of other things, that they have no place in the service, and they've been doing all this critical race theory indoctrination in the armed forces of the United States. So when you're being led by people like this, then obviously they're not going to be paying much attention to what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan. And also, again, we've had situations like this with our generals and the general staff in Israel, where they talk about, we had in the Second Lebanon War, where we were so ill-led by the Chief of Staff, Don Khalus, and he said that Israel needed to stage a scene of victory in the village of Bint Jbeil, and he sent our forces in there with no cover and with no real plan to take any kind of areas of that village in a coherent way, and it was a killing field. He just sent them in there to die because he thought that you could just imagine a victory. You could just put something on camera, you could stage it like it's just a show, and that'll be enough. And that's not enough. If you want to when you actually have to defeat your enemies, you can't there's no picture of victory. You don't have somebody planting the flag in Iwo Jima without actually conquering Iwo Jima. You had tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers and Marines who were killed in the Pacific before they weren't doing it in order to take a picture of themselves planting the flag at Iwo Jima. They were doing it to defeat Imperial Japan. And somehow or another, people have fallen so in love with imagery of victory that they forget what was necessary in order to reach that point in the real world. And so in the United States, you have a reflection of that in Mark Milley, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Lloyd Austin, in another four-star general, who's the Secretary of Defense. They have these ideas that are totally divorced from reality. So I think in part, maybe Joe Biden's very clear dementia. I mean, he is clearly not he does not control anything. He can't pay attention to things. All of his speeches are on teleprompters.
Does he make the decisions though? This speech was, I mean, for the first time.
The one from all of them were terrible. All of them have been terrible.
But the last one was he doesn't write his speeches. Come on, someone there thinks they're in control, and obviously, what I read Ayan Khirsi Ali. I like to read her. She wrote something for Unheard, and she said, this is the consequence of getting used to running your shop without any criticism, whatever. The press just said amen. This Jean Psaki is just it's an unbelievable joke. They think they can just paper everything over with like bland phrases, and they've been for quite a while now running their shop without any criticism, and so they felt there were no consequences. It's like the press, instead of describing the world, has erected a wall through which we cannot see the world. I've been saying this, I don't know if you saw on Twitter, for a while now, that the real story everywhere is the press. Because if it was not for the press, we would not have this ridiculous government, because these people would have been shamed out of office by a realistic, normal press. And we have the same thing. The press has been building up a marionette. Who is Biden? Biden is one of the greatest failures in the history of American politics. There was not one foreign policy decision in his 40 years in Washington that he was right about. He is ridiculous, and his son is a permanent security hazard. His family was in bed with China, what not? And the press has been singing Russian collusion about Trump. And so,
but I think you're right. But again, I think that, I mean, nobody take second place. I take second place to nobody, including you, Dr. Taub, in, my criticism of the media. I don't. But I have to say that, you also have to blame the policymakers. I mean, they're the ones who wanted this job. And you're right. They, it was stunning, and all they do is spin. I mean, first of all, there was a stunning Politico article by their White House correspondent who said that it was like early last week. She wrote that the Biden administration is angry because it's not getting its props from the press on the great achievements that they've been making in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, they literally thought that they should be getting praise for all the people that they were bringing out. And I mean, it was a lie on every level, right? Because they were blocking people from getting in. They blocked American citizens from getting in. They gave the Taliban the ability to block U.S. citizens, to block Afghans who were supposed to be getting out from getting to the airport in the first place. And the idea that they would surrender perimeter security of the airport, the approaches to the airport, to their enemies, who now they're pretending, apropos of absolutely nothing, with no proof, with no evidence, that they're now their partners, is insane. I mean, obviously there wouldn't have been Americans left behind if the United States had controlled the roads to the airport. They would have all been able to leave, as would, a very large number of Afghans who were supposed to leave, and probably a lot of the Taliban and Al Qaeda and ISIS terrorists who found their way out of the country would have been blocked if the Americans had been doing the vetting and if they were in charge of the roadblocks. But they surrendered that to the Taliban while claiming that the Taliban were their allies and their partners. But the thing is that
so they didn't see it coming. They didn't see it coming.
Well, let me just make one point. All they're doing is spinning. The idea that you can liken what they're doing to the Berlin airlift is insane, right? And yet they continue to repeat these lies over and over and over again. The biggest airlift in history, but they were the reason that there had to be an airlift. It was all their fault, and they did it poorly. I mean, my friend Jen Dyer, who also tweets that she's a former naval intelligence analyst. She's brilliant, and she wrote, Biden was saying there were 200 Americans left behind. She said that's one airplane. One airplane. You see, it's 200. One airplane, and they left a day before the end of the deadline. So if they had actually been organized, if this had been a successful airlift like the Berlin airlift was, then they wouldn't have been left behind. So it's all a lie. And you look at it and you just say, why did they do it? Why did they? I don't know. Did they want to have a debacle? This is already in the realm of conspiracy theory, maybe. But I always said with Obama, when people were asking me, is he an anti-Semite, or is it just that his aspirations are antithetical to Israel's national interests and to the civil rights of Jews? And I would say it doesn't matter. I can say, my gut feeling is that Barack Obama hates Jews. I mean, he likes liberal Jews, but he hates Jews. He hates Israeli Jews. He hates religious Jews, and so on and so forth. But who cares if I'm right or wrong? It's irrelevant. The point is that if you're a policymaker, your policy has practical implications. So did Biden and his crew, were they sitting in dark rooms, smoking their cigars and twirling their mustaches and trying to figure out how to make the United States suffer the gravest shame and the biggest strategic catastrophe in post-war history, to lose the trust of all of its allies and to reap the scorn of all of their enemies whom they empower? I doubt it. But if they did, or if they didn't, we got to this result. And I don't think that if they had been planning to do this to cause maximum harm against the United States, that they would have done anything differently from what actually happened.
Yeah, no, but it's crucial to understanding where this is going, and clearly this is going to an Iran deal, and the question is, are they now? Will there be some modesty? Are they internalizing the size of the magnitude of their collapse? I think there would have been an opportunity here if Israel and some of our friends and some of the American patriots in the Republican Party would have leveraged this to say, no, this is not the right time to empower another terrorist state, which is clearly what they're doing. And then this is why I'm asking, because I'm asking myself, what are they thinking? Are they still hanging on to the ridiculous philosophy of Obama that if you give Iran a stake in the game, it would be tamed, it would become responsible? And are they still thinking this after their collapse in Taliban, or are they just on automatic pilot? This is their Northern Star, this abominable deal that's going to grant Iran nuclear weapons.
I think that and this is basically the point of my Newsweek articles, that they're not interested in learning any of their lessons. I mean, Biden was very clear about that in his speech on Monday night, because he said, I did everything right. This was a triumph. This is an American triumph. Who was at fault? Who caused all the problems? The Afghan army, the American citizens who didn't make it to the airport in time. Tough luck. It's their fault. And of course, Donald Trump.
Did you see that tweet by Ben Shapiro? He said he imitated Biden and said it was a success and it was Trump's fault.
Yes, I mean, but he didn't just blame Trump. Trump, we're used to blame the Americans who he abandoned to their fate under the Taliban. I'm surprised he didn't blame the dogs for not getting out of their cages that they were caged in, waiting to get on the airplane, and just jumping into the airplanes on their own. I mean, he blamed everybody except himself because he was perfect. So I think that his behavior, is very indicative of the fact that these people are completely incapable of learning. And moreover, Tony Blinken and Biden both said what? They said, oh, well, we're going to continue to fund Afghanistan. They both highlighted the fact that the United States is going to give humanitarian aid to the Taliban. I thought that that was also remarkable. So no, they're not going to learn anything, and I don't think that American allies can do anything about it except hold them in scorn and ill repute and not listen to them and defy them, because that the only way that they'll learn is if they start getting the cold shoulder from Israel, from Britain, from France, from Germany, which, by the way, Britain, France, and Germany are already giving them. And I mean that's a fact. And the British Parliament gave a no confidence vote to Biden. I mean, that's incredible. And you have people like Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of British forces in NATO, saying that he should be court-martialed as commander in chief. And I think that all of these people, by the way, are right. But we only have about 10 minutes, or maybe we have more time. We have more than that. We have 25 minutes left of this show. But I do also want to bring it to Israel, because I mean, the thing that I thought was most telling was that in the midst of all of this, Naftali Bennett, our prime minister, who enjoys the support of 5% of the Israeli public, which is even lower than Biden, he comes to Washington. He demands to see the president in the middle of this great catastrophe, and he met with the great Sullivan. He met with Tony Blinken. He met with the great Lloyd Austin, and then finally, a day late, he met with Biden in the White House. And he said after the meeting that he had achieved everything that he set out to accomplish in Washington, D.C. And putting aside Naftali's spin on this, according to a readout of the conversation that Biden had with Bennett, that was given by Barbara Leaf, who's the point person at the National Security Council for Israel. She's also a radical leftist who supports peace now, but then so is everybody else in this administration, so why not? But she said that, Naftali said that he and Biden didn't talk about the Palestinians at all, but they just talked about Iran. It works out that that was another Naftali lie, that the Americans wouldn't let go of the Palestinian issue, that they made some very clear demands on Israel. And we saw that Israel abided by all of the demands, because everything that the Americans were demanding was happening on the ground in Israel, while Naftali was in midair on his way back home. But what were those things that the Americans said? First of all, they're completely obsessed with Jerusalem, which is amazing, and it's still not clear where this government is going to fall on this. But Biden demanded that Israel allow the opening of the U.S. consulate to the Palestinians in Israel's capital city. He's this is just very briefly, this is unprecedented that any government, allied, enemy, whatever, would say to a host government, we demand that you allow us to open a diplomatic legation to another political entity in your capital city where we have an embassy. This, I mean, people say, well, there was a consulate. Yeah, but there was a consulate that was founded in 1844, so that, it existed in 1948 when Israel was established, and Israel had to accept the U.S. consulate. But when the American embassy was moved to Jerusalem in 2018, there was no reason to have a consulate there anymore, because the embassy handled all the consular affairs as well, and so they closed it. Once you close it, the only way you can open it again is for the host country to approve it. So Israel has to approve a U.S. consulate in Jerusalem for the PLO before the Americans can open it under international law. So either they're not going to ask for Israeli approval, which would be a hostile act, or they will. And if the government gives it, then then the government here is even worse than we thought. But it looks like it may, because it's not saying what it's going to do yet. The other thing that they said is, did you know that the buildings in Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon Tzaddik neighborhood in East Jerusalem are owned by American Jews?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're not owned by Israeli Jews. They're owned by American Jews. So these are homes that have had Arab squatters in them since the time of the Jordanian occupation of East Jerusalem. And since 1971, the Jewish owners of these homes, and this was bought by Jews in the late 19th century. So this has been Jewish property from time immemorial. And when Israel restored its sovereignty to Eastern Jerusalem, the Jewish owners tried to get back their property. And they've had these Arab squatters in there since. So the Americans are saying, we do not want you to grant the property rights to the owners of these homes, that the squatters must be allowed to remain in place. So the American government is saying to the Israeli government, you must deny the property rights to American citizens who are Jews in Jerusalem, in your country, not in our country, because they're Jewish. So it's both anti-American, they're denying the property rights of American citizens, and it's, of course, anti-Semitic, because the reason that they're doing it is because these specific American citizens are also Jewish. So that's the other thing that they're demanding of the government. It's not clear what Naftali said. They want the government to continue to restore funding to the Palestinian Authority, despite the fact that doing so is against American law and against Israeli law, because both countries passed laws that barred them both from transferring money to the Palestinian Authority, so long as the Palestinian Authority continues to pay the salaries of terrorists. The Palestinian Authority does, and the Americans are demanding that Israel give them money. And so Israel.
But this is a golden opportunity, Caroline, for you, I think, to explain clearly, because you do this repeatedly in your writing, the connection between Afghanistan, the realignment, and the Iran deal, and the Palestinian and the American view of the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, because this is all part of the same tapestry.
Well, I mean, I think, again, if you're talking about this idea of expiating sin, right, from the West, through self-abnegation and surrender to the third world, who you consider to be a victim by virtue of the fact that they're not you, then the Palestinians are sort of the archetype of the third world victim that you're supposed to appease, because I think Lee Smith actually wrote a beautiful article about it called the Dream Palace of the Americans in Tablet this past week, and he's not tilling new soil, but it was a beautiful piece of writing. So I would urge everybody to just pick it up and read it, because it was an enjoyable read. But he recalled the fact that the Palestinians were the creation of the KGB. Arafat was a KGB agent, and the idea behind it, and even before the PLO started, the KGB came out when they were still the NKVD. They came up with this idea after the Holocaust to transpose anti-Semitism into anti-Zionism. So Slansky in the Slansky trials of the Hungarian communists who were Jews was a Zionist. He's a communist. He was the head of the Communist Party who was a Jew, but they turned him into a Zionist because they couldn't call him a dirty Jew, so they called him a dirty Zionist.
Zio, as they call him, as the radical left does it now in American universities. Yeah.
Right. That's the updated language. But the doctors plot that Stalin had against Soviet Jews, also they were Zionists. They were accused of being Zionists. So this was already as far back as 1949 it began. But the basic idea behind the PLO was that if the Soviets believed rightly that after the Holocaust, the West had pledged to never abandon the Jews again, to never turn on the Jews as they had in the Holocaust. And the Soviets said that if they could convince the West to embrace hatred of Jews again in the form of anti-Zionism, then the West would no longer be able to make a coherent moral argument for itself. And so the reason why the Palestinians were created, because there was never a nation called the Palestinians. They have no shared past. They have no history. They have no culture that's uniquely theirs, except being on the front line of the war against Israel. Their entire national identity is like a negative image of the Zionist movement. So it was always.
So I'll recommend another book at this as a footnote to what you're saying. It's a book. By the way, they're leftists, both of them, called The War of Return. It's been published in America too. It's by Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf. Einat is a former member of Knesset in the Labour Party. But what they're saying is that the center of the Palestinians are not going to give up what they call the right of return. That is the return of the descendants of the refugees to Israel proper, because this is the heart of their ethos. The heart of their ethos is the destruction of the Jewish state, and so there's no middle ground between the two narratives. But I'll add also, if you don't mind, a more practical political connection between the two sides of the policy before Afghanistan, Iran on the one hand and the Palestinians on the other, is that under Netanyahu and Trump, Iran was being cornered, and the way to corner Iran was to create the Abraham Accords. It's to create the Sunni alliances with states who realized that Iran is the real threat, not Israel, and that Israel is actually one of the most powerful allies they can have in the war on Iran. And the way the Obama administration tried to prevent that was by saying there will be no peace before you solve the Palestinian issue. And so what Biden is doing now is taking apart the alliance that pushed Iran into a corner. So he has to take apart the Abraham Accords, and he has to reinstall the Palestinian veto in order to take apart the strategic partnership of Saudi Arabia, the United Emirates, Israel, and possibly other Sunni countries.
Let me actually just put your practical thing into the framework of the ideological concept of the political warfare behind the Palestinians. And
that's switching our roles, Caroline.
Right, but sorry, but whatever. Anything goes today, don't you know? But the framework, the concept of an Abraham Accord is precisely the response to the fake Palestinian nationalism narrative, right? Which is just a lie, that there was an ancient people here. They went back to the Canaanites and the cavemen and the Neanderthals, and they were all Palestinians, right? And I mean, this is a complete lie. But the antidote to that is the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords say, no, the Jews are the children of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the Arabs are the children of Abraham and Ibrahim. And we can come together as the peoples, as the indigenous peoples, the natives of this region. That is the whole concept behind the Abraham Accords. And that is why the Biden administration has refused under all circumstances to call them by their name, because if they call them by their name, then they're acknowledging that Israel has a right to exist, that the Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, and that the entire edifice of Israeli colonialism, of the Zio capitalist, white supremacist apartheid that they claim that Israel is the manifestation of, that all of that is a complete and utter lie, and they can't do that. And that is really what stands behind their almost crazed, lunatic obsession with never calling the peace treaties by their actual name, the Abraham Accords. So I think that that's also just a very key aspect of it.
That's brilliant.
The whole thing, the concept, the name Abraham Accord is brilliant. It was David Friedman's idea, and it was correct, and it works, and that's why everybody immediately tied into it, because it's just true. And the truth is it's a great product to sell. It's really easy to sell it. People like it, and so that's just the thing. The concept of narcissism, though, as a central point of American foreign policy, and also of the Israeli left to a very large degree, I think is also understated, and it's important to give it more prominence, because they really do believe that America can just walk away from a war and say it's over, even though the United States didn't start the war, right? America didn't attack anybody on 9/11. The United States left the Taliban alone until the Al-Qaeda terrorists that they had harbored since 1995, when the Sudanese threw them out, decided that they were going to use their bases in Afghanistan to plan and to organize for the 9/11 attacks. And so Biden said, "Oh, well, I'm president when the 9/11 attacks turned 20. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until 9/11/21, and then on that day I'm going to stand in front of the Freedom Towers or in front of the Pentagon at the 9/11 memorial, and I'm going to declare the war officially over," which is why the original date for the departure of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan was supposed to be September 11th. There's nothing more insane than that, because the whole concept, I get to decide when a war that I didn't start ends, when I didn't defeat my enemy. The Taliban is well placed to restore its complete control over Afghanistan if I ever leave. So these concepts are at the root of everything. They're also at the root of the whole concept of a two-state solution. Israel didn't start the Arab war against it. It certainly didn't start the Palestinian national movement, except to the extent that the Palestinian movement, the national movement, was a creation of genocidal Arab.
And a reaction to Zionism
by genocidal Arab Nazis, right, who wanted to expand the Holocaust to the Jewish community in the land of Israel and pre-state Israel. So, Israel didn't tell anybody to go out and attack it. It came in peace. The Zionist pioneers who began settling, the land, ahead of the creation of the state of Israel in 48, they didn't come here as an antithesis to the Arabs. They didn't come here out of spite. They didn't come here to civilize the natives. These weren't British colonialists. These weren't French colonialists. These were Jews going to the land of Israel to restore their national sovereignty after 1800 years. So there was no negative ethos to Zionism. The negative ethos was entirely the response to Zionism by the Arabs. And then later, it sort of polarized into the Palestinians as a terrorist nationalist movement. And so, this concept that Israel, we can just end it. We can end the war that Hezbollah started against us because they want to annihilate. Just by leaving Lebanon, we can make the Hamas no longer hate us or the PLO like us by giving them Gaza lock, stock, and barrel. This is all lunatic narcissism. And at the heart of the whole concept of the Palestinian conflict with Israel is this idea that all of these things that have happened in the Middle East, everything, all of the terrorism, all of the wars, it's all the Jews' fault. Why is it the Jews' fault? Because we won't quit the land of Israel. We won't leave Judea and Samaria. We won't leave Jerusalem, and at the end of the day, if we leave those areas, then we'll leave Tel Aviv as well, because we can't defend Tel Aviv without them. So it's all Israel's fault. Why? Because Israel exists. And if Israel doesn't stop existing, or if it isn't waking up in the morning, having lunch in the afternoon, going to bed at nighttime, apologizing for its existence and giving more and more of its land away to people sworn to its destruction, then it's evil. It's all the same concept.
So the anti-Semitic element that the Palestinians still represent, is this also, in your opinion, an animating force behind the Biden administration? I mean, I'm not. Is it? I know Ilhan Omar, we understand. Rashida Tlaib, we understand. We even understand the anti-Semitic Jewish so-called leftist or peaceniks. But is this now a central feature of the Biden administration too?
It is, but I mean, there are a lot of different manifestations of Jew hatred that are taking form in the United States today. I mean, I'll just give you an example. Among American Jews, like Dan Shapiro, who Biden just appointed to be Israel's babysitter on everything having to do with Iran. He gave a statement where he said that it was racist to cast aspersions on Mahir Bitar, who said that who is a BDS supporter, and now he's also in charge of all intelligence traffic in the U.S. government because he's the senior director for intelligence in the National Security Council. I think people might wonder what he did with all the intelligence reports saying that the Taliban was going to rapidly take over the country when the United States left, and that the Afghan government and the Afghan army wasn't going to be able to withstand the Taliban onslaught in the absence of close air support, in the absence of American contractors directing air traffic from Bagram Air Base, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's also important to know. But Dan Shapiro and a lot of the Tikkun Olam Reform Jews who are in very prominent positions in the Biden administration have suffer from a form of anti-Semitism, because as they see it, to be a Jew means to be a leftist Democrat, and that's how they define their faith. And so it's very similar to the expiation of sin through self-abnegation on the global level and empowering your enemies. So here, Israel, which is a manifestation of authentic traditional Judaism, which is based on the three pillars of the Torah, the land of Israel, and the people of Israel, then their Judaism cannot be successful if Israel is successful. So I think that a large part of their identity as American Jews ends up being expressed through hostility towards Israel, because again, if Israel is the authentic representation of the Jewish people, which of course it is, then they're an inauthentic representation of that people or of that faith, and therefore they feel themselves to be in a state of existential crisis or conflict with the state of Israel as reinvented Jews, or as Jews whose Judaism is fully manifested in their political faith in liberalism and progressivism. So that's one form. And obviously you have the Islamist anti-Semites like Mahir Bitan and Hadi Amar and others who have spoken on behalf of Hamas, who have supported BDS, Rima Dodin in the White House. There are a whole lot of them in the Biden administration, very key positions at the State Department, at the Justice Department, in the White House, and the National Security Council. So, you see those sort of Ilhan Omar type of anti-Semites as well represented in the West Wing. And then finally, you have the progressives in the administration. And here too, I mean, progressivism really is cultural Marxism, and it's very anti-American. And the concept that America and Israel are kind of kindred spirits on the global stage, that Israel is just sort of a mini-me of America in terms of its national character, as it's seen by both progressives and, by the way, by nationalists, is it turns it into an object of hatred and derision among progressives. So they're allied with Islamists, and they're allied with Tikkun Olam Jews, and I think that all of them are well represented in this government. Yeah.
So now we have a government here that is I don't know how to. I don't want to use too strong a term, but has agreed basically to subordinate ourselves under the language of friendship and cooperation, and let's call each other, not fight or sling mud through the media and all that, which basically means that Israel would just bow down to the demands of an American regime, which is, I don't know if hostile is the word, but at least unsympathetic to Israel's interest and operates against Israel, or defines its own interest in contrast to ours. So last word about because we said we'll talk about it, about what this would mean for Judea and Samaria and for the so-called peace process.
So right now, we're seeing on the ground, and I wrote about this in my column for Israel Hayom, which is coming out on Friday. I spent some time on Monday going around and looking at all these threatened Jewish communities in Judea, in Gush Etzion, which is where I live, which is in the consensus not only of the entire country, but on the left. You had leftist leaders like Tzipi Livni and Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, who all said that the large settlement blocks, like, first and foremost, Gush Etzion, would be left as part of sovereign Israel in any peace settlement. But you see that the government now is allowing massive illegal building by the Palestinians all over Gush Etzion. And one of the places where you're about to have building approved for the Palestinians in Gush Etzion is inside of of the settlement of Alon Shvut and Rosh Surim. It's this little cluster of Palestinian Arab dwellings that were just supposed to be seasonal homes for agricultural workers who own grape vineyards next to Alon Shvut. But they suddenly, it hasn't, grown at all over the past many, many years. And suddenly they asked for 50 new housing units in it. And they're about to get them approved by the civil administration. When that happens, they're going to take over this walking path that connects all of the different villages in Gush Etzion one to the other, so that basically, and it's all funded by France. They've invested 1.25 million euros in this planning scheme for the Palestinians inside of Alon Shvut. And the idea is to turn them all from a flourishing block of communities that you can walk from one to the other on Shabbat when people don't drive. They're going to be cut off from one another. And this is the Bennett government who's allowing it, and they're allowing it in part because of American pressure, and in part because they're dominated by radical leftists. So, this is what's happening here. But I'll just end on a hopeful note, because I think I don't really know what's going to happen in the United States. I don't know whether it's just the elites that are going to fall and collapse, and American society is going to rise up. Like, people like Lee Smith again is of the opinion will happen, or you're going to get something not such a rosy scenario unfolding in the United States. But here in Israel, I'm the more I think about it, the more I think that if the Bennett government really does start moving in a very existentially dangerous direction, whether it's vis-a-vis Iran or the Palestinians, that the government will fall. I mean, and so either it's going to actually have to do the things necessary to secure Israel's survival, not only of the Iranian nuclear threat, but of the Biden administration at this point. But I think that either they're going to do that or they'll fall, and the right wing under Netanyahu will be able to form a new government. I really, because the Israeli people are just too psychologically healthy still to abide by a government that places Israel in existential peril. So I think, on that level, I'm very worried, but I'm also kind of assured, because I do have faith in the public, and I think that it just we won't allow it to happen.
As a happy note, I can tell you it's medium happy. It's sub jolly, but this is we're nearing the time that we're going to put we're going to איך אומרים לטבול, to dip an apple in honey.
Oh yes, we have to. You're right. We have to end this on a happy note. I really do believe it is. Oh my goodness! You know what just happened? One of my cooking videos that was up on my computer. It's Mivashlim im Jeki. Jeki is this great Moroccan chef, and I was just going over how to make a Moroccan Rosh Hashanah dish called pastilla. So at any rate, so you all just got to hear a little bit of Jeki.
That's and people don't know that your microphone is actually on a cookbook now.
Yes,
because,
it is.
because before this podcast started, that's what we were discussing, the Rosh Hashanah dinner.
It's true.
Because as you know, all Jewish holidays are about, they tried to kill us, we escaped, now let's eat.
Right. And as a Jewish mother, you see, it all actually, everybody says the men have to go to synagogue. We go to synagogue too, but that all the mitzvot are on the men. But that's not true, because the entire holiday and every Shabbat is actually, unless you're in a progressive household, which I most certainly am not, then all of the cooking falls on the mom. So between writing about the strategic collapse of the U.S.A., I'm also perusing the recipes and kosher by design for the holidays. So, you know.
Now, so that's a happy note to end
That's
on,
right.
Carmen.
So we should all wish you Chag Sameach, Shana Tova, and we should all be written in the book of life. And this should be a good year. And Godspeed to everybody in Afghanistan who's stuck there. And may we all know better and healthier and happier times in 5782.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, Gadi.
See you next year.
And be sure to subscribe to the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour in the new year. We're going to give you a discount. If you subscribe today, it'll be free of charge.
And even 10% less.
It'll be 10% less than zero.
Shalom v'toda.
Bye-bye.
See you, Carolyn. Shana Tova.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Shana Tova.